The wind howled low across the plains, carrying with it a sting of snow that pressed against the walls of Elias McGraw's ranch house. The boards creaked as the cold shifted through the timbers, and the shutters rattled now and then like an old man's teeth in winter. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth burned with a steady orange glow, but even its warmth seemed too small against the immensity of the cold night. Elias sat in his chair by the fire, a wool blanket pulled across his knees, his face, marked with deep lines carved by years of sun and sorrow, was turned toward the flames, his eyes half-lidded in thought. His silver hair, unkempt but clean, caught the flickering light, giving him the appearance of a man halfway between the living and the shadows of memory. The silence was heavy in that house, not just the silence of a winter's night, but the silence of a man who had lived too long without laughter. The clock ticked from the mantel, steady and unforgiving, its sound filling spaces where voices once had been. Elias shifted in his chair and let out a slow sigh, one he didn't realize he had been holding. Every day for him was much the same. Rise before dawn, stoke the fire, see to the cattle that still remained in his barn. There were fewer of them now than in his younger days, when the ranch had been alive with the sound of hooves and the shouts of hired hands. Age had whittled both him and his herd down to remnants. He worked slower now, his back stiff, his breath heavy in the cold morning air. By evening he would sit with a plate of beans or bread and stew, his only conversation the occasional mutter to himself or the crackle of the fire. It had been years since Mary, his wife, passed. Sometimes, when the night stretched long like this one, Elias would catch himself turning toward the kitchen, expecting to see her bent over the stove, humming that same soft tune she always carried when supper was nearly ready. Other times, when the wind rattled the windows, he would imagine her voice calling from the other room, "Elias, make sure you've latched the barn doors tight." The house carried echoes of her that refused to fade, and though he cherished them, each echo was also a reminder of her absence. He closed his eyes and leaned back, the blanket heavy on his knees, and memory pulled him backward. He remembered a summer day, years ago, when Mary had run through the tall grass behind the house, her skirt lifted in her hands as she laughed and called for him to keep up. He remembered her hair catching the sunlight like strands of gold, her face bright with the joy of life. They had been younger then, their hearts bold with dreams. They'd built this ranch together, plank by plank, fence by fence. Every stone in the hearth had passed through his hands, every seam of the curtain sewn by hers. The place was theirs, a monument to their love and work. Now it was only his. And it felt far too big for one man's soul to fill. The town still respected Elias, that much he knew. Folks nodded when they saw him in town, tipped their hats, spoke with polite voices. But none lingered long. They saw him as reliable, steady, and distant. He was a man carved from wood and silence, a rancher who had given his life to the land and was now little more than a figure at its edge. Children whispered stories that he was a ghost who still walked though his wife was gone. Adults knew better, but they, too, kept their distance. Some losses are so visible that people shy away, fearing to catch the weight of grief as though it were contagious. Elias had accepted it. Loneliness had become his companion, the fire his conversation partner, the wind his nightly guest. He didn't complain, didn't reach out. To him, this was simply the way of things. The world had taken Mary, and with her went the last part of him that had ever needed company. That night, the snow came heavier. It rattled on the windows, piled against the porch, and groaned against the old barn doors. Elias stirred in his chair, listening. He thought of the cattle, just a few head left, but precious still, and hoped the barn would hold. He considered getting up, checking the latch, but the fire's warmth pinned him there, and his body was tired from the day's work. He told himself he'd check when the flames burned lower. Then, through the roar of the storm, a sound rose that did not belong to the wind. At first, Elias thought it a trick of memory, some ghostly echo, but the sound grew clearer, the muffled clatter of hooves striking hard ground, rhythmic and insistent, fighting against the snow. He straightened in his chair, heart quickening. No one traveled these parts at night, especially not in a storm like this. Yet the sound was unmistakable. Horses. More than one. He rose slowly, his knees stiff, and crossed the room to the window. Through the blur of snow, shapes emerged. 7 riders, cloaked and bent low against the wind, struggling their way up the path toward his ranch. The sight startled Elias. 7 figures on horseback, women by their frames, and the long skirts that peeked from beneath their cloaks. The snow clung to them, turning them into pale phantoms against the dark night. He moved to the door, his hand on the latch, watching as they drew nearer. His breath fogged in the cold air seeping through the cracks. He hadn't had visitors in months, and never had strangers arrived in such a way. The riders slowed at the gate, their horses snorting steam into the air, hooves crunching deep into the snow. One of the women, her face shadowed beneath a hood, called out through the wind. Her voice was muffled, trembling with cold, but it carried a note of desperation. "Sir! Please, may we stay the night?" Elias hesitated. His instinct was to guard his solitude, to retreat back into the warmth of his fire and pretend he had not heard. But the plea in her voice, the sight of the 7 weary riders, their horses trembling and breath steaming in the frigid air, it struck something in him, something long buried beneath the weight of loneliness. He opened the door wider, the wind rushing in around him, and nodded once. "Come in," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The women exchanged glances of relief, then urged their horses forward through the gate. Elias stepped back, holding the door open against the storm, his heart pounding with a strange mix of unease and anticipation. He did not know it then, but in opening his door that night, he was also opening his heart to change, a change he had not dared to hope for in all the long years since Mary had gone. The door banged against the wind as Elias held it open, bracing himself against the icy blast. Snow swirled in, clinging to the floorboards, but the women didn't wait. One by one they dismounted their horses, their boots crunching through the heavy drifts, their cloaks whipping in the gale. Elias watched silently as they drew closer, their faces half hidden beneath fur-lined hoods, their breaths steaming in the frigid air. The first of them reached the porch, her gloved hand clutching the railing as though it were a lifeline. She lifted her head, and in the glow of the lantern Elias saw her face, strong, lined not by age but by hardship. Her eyes were clear and steady, though exhaustion dulled their light. Behind her, 6 others gathered, shivering, each one carrying herself with a resilience that struck him. Elias nodded toward the open door. "Get inside, you'll freeze out here." The women did not hesitate. They stepped into the cabin, stamping snow from their boots, their cloaks dripping onto the floor. The sudden rush of bodies filled the small room with noise and warmth, a shocking change from the silence Elias had lived in for so long. He pulled the door closed, shutting out the storm. The house seemed to breathe, the fire crackling louder now that it had company. For a moment, Elias simply stood, unsure what to say. His cabin was a man's place, simple, bare, lived in, without thought for appearances. He wondered if these women saw the dust in the corners, the patched curtains, the old rocking chair worn smooth by years of use, but they didn't seem to notice. Their hands stretched toward the fire, their shoulders sagging as the heat touched them. The woman who had first spoken turned back to him. She pushed back her hood, revealing hair streaked with silver, though her face was still handsome and strong. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'm Clara. We were caught on the road coming back from town. The storm came faster than we expected." She gestured to the others. "We'd not have made it another mile without shelter." Elias gave a short nod. "You'll find warmth here. Sit, all of you. Rest." His voice came out rough, unused to company, but he meant the words. The women introduced themselves one by one. Margaret, broad-shouldered and soft-eyed, with a steady calm in her voice. June, younger than the rest, with a quick smile even in her exhaustion. Eliza, sharp-faced and practical, her gaze always assessing the room. Ruth, tall and quiet, her eyes taking in everything without comment. Hannah, gentle, with a faint tremor in her hands. And finally Mary, small and soft-spoken, who stayed near the fire as though drawn to its heart. Elias listened, storing their names, their voices. 7 widows, he learned soon enough, though none said it as though seeking pity. Each spoke of the farms they kept, the land they worked alone since their husbands had passed, illness, accident, hardship of frontier life. Their words were plain, without embellishment, but Elias felt the weight of them. These were women carved by the same hard land that had shaped him, carrying burdens that would have broken many men. He brought out what food he had: bread, beans, a bit of salted pork, and set it on the table. The women accepted with gratitude, passing plates, sharing quietly at first, then more freely. The sound of their voices filled the cabin like birdsong in spring. Elias sat at the far end of the table, eating little, watching much. It had been years since his home had held such life. Clara, the one who seemed their leader, looked across at him after a while. "You live alone, mister?" "McGraw," he said. "Elias." Her brows lifted slightly. "All this land? Just you?" "Just me," he replied. There was a pause, then June laughed lightly, shaking her head. "No wonder you looked half startled when we knocked. You're not used to company." Elias's lips twitched, almost a smile, though it faded quickly. "Been a while." The conversation carried on. They asked little of him, but their stories wove together, painting a picture of 7 lives, bound by loss, yet held steady by grit. Elias found himself listening closely, his chest tightening with a mix of admiration and something he could not name. As the night deepened, the storm outside roared, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the door. Inside, though, warmth spread. Margaret insisted on helping clear the dishes. Mary mended a glove by the fire, her needle glinting in the lamplight. Clara teased Elias for sitting so still, saying, "You look like a man afraid to move, in case we all vanish and you're left talking to the fire again." For the first time in years, Elias chuckled. The sound startled him as much as it did the women, who smiled at one another. Later, when most of them settled near the fire to rest, Elias remained awake in his chair. He watched them, 7 widows, strong yet weary, their faces softened by sleep, their cloaks pulled around them. His house, once a hollow shell of silence, now breathed with life. He turned his gaze to the window, where snow still pressed against the glass, the storm far from done. He should have felt uneasy with strangers filling his home, but instead there was a stirring in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or what these women's place in his life might become. But he knew one thing: the night no longer felt empty, and for Elias McGraw, that was the beginning of change. The night deepened, the cabin walls creaking under the weight of the storm. Outside, the wind screamed across the plains, carrying snow in sheets that rattled the shutters and pressed against the door like a restless spirit trying to get in. Inside, the fire still burned, its light dancing across the women's faces as they dozed or whispered softly to one another. Elias sat in his chair, his eyes on the window, listening to the storm's fury. He had lived through many winters, but something about this one gnawed at him. The snow was heavier than it should be, the wind too wild. His mind kept drifting to the barn, standing old and stubborn against the storm. Inside were the last of his cattle, 6 head that had carried him through these lonely years. They weren't just animals. They were his livelihood, the only reason he still woke before dawn, the last thing tethering him to the land he and Mary had built. Without them, he would have nothing left but silence. He rose slowly, careful not to wake those sleeping. His boots thudded softly against the wooden floor as he crossed to the window. The glass was fogged, but through the blur of snow he could make out the faint outline of the barn, its roof already wearing a heavy crown of white. He pressed his palm against the cold pane, a knot tightening in his chest. "You're worrying about something." The voice was quiet, steady. Elias turned and saw Ruth sitting upright near the fire, her blanket around her shoulders, her dark eyes watching him. She hadn't been asleep after all. Elias hesitated, then gave a short nod. Barn won't hold if this keeps up. Cattle'll be lost. Ruth rose, moving closer, her presence calm. Then we shore it up. Simple as that. He almost laughed, a bitter sound. In this storm? You've seen it out there. I'd not risk anyone. By then, the others were stirring. Clara pushed herself upright, brushing hair from her face, her sharp eyes narrowing. What's this about? The barn, Ruth said plainly. He thinks it might go down. Clara was on her feet at once. Then what are we waiting for? Let's get to it. Elias's mouth opened, then closed. He looked from Clara's fierce expression to Ruth's steady gaze, then to the others now waking and rising, Margaret adjusting her cloak, June already pulling on her boots, Eliza tying back her hair with brisk movements. Mary looked frightened but determined, her small hands clutching the edge of her shawl. You don't understand, Elias said, his voice hard. That barn's near as old as I am. Wind like this, snow piling fast. It's dangerous work. I won't have blood on my hands. Clara stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. And what would you have instead? Watch your herd die while we sit warm inside. We're not porcelain dolls, Elias McGraw. We've fought storms before. You open that door, and we'll stand with you. For a long moment, the only sound was the storm pressing against the walls, as though it listened for his answer. Then Elias let out a slow breath, his resistance crumbling under the sheer will before him. He nodded once. Fine, but you do exactly as I say. They bundled themselves against the cold, cloaks drawn tight, scarves wrapped around faces, gloves pulled snug. Elias pulled on his heavy coat and hat, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear of the storm, but from the strange feeling welling in him. For years, he had faced the cold alone. Now, for the first time, he would not step into it by himself. When he threw open the door, the storm rushed in like a beast. Snow slashed across their faces, wind clawing at cloaks, nearly driving them back inside. But Clara led the way, head bowed against the gale, and the others followed close behind. Elias brought up the rear, forcing the door shut before the fire could be stolen. The world outside was chaos. Snowdrifts swallowed the path, and the barn loomed ahead, its shape blurred by white. The roof groaned under the weight, and the old timbers creaked in protest. The cattle inside bawled, their cries carrying faint but frantic through the storm. "Move!" Elias shouted, his voice nearly stolen by the wind. They fought their way forward, boots sinking deep, snow stinging their faces. At the barn doors, Elias heaved them open, the hinges shrieking. Warm breath and the musky smell of cattle poured out, the animals shifting nervously in their stalls. The roof above groaned again, snow sliding down its slope. "Get those ropes!" Elias barked. Eliza was already pulling a coil from the wall, her movements swift and sure. June dragged planks from a pile, bracing them against the walls. Margaret, strong as an ox, shouldered beams heavier than Elias thought possible. Ruth climbed to reinforce a crack in the wall, her hands steady despite the cold. Elias moved among them, shouting directions, his heart hammering. He saw Clara tying ropes with hands that did not falter, Mary spreading blankets over the cattle to keep them calm, Hannah fetching buckets of snow to pack against the weaker boards. The barn became a whirlwind of motion, women and rancher working side by side, each movement vital. The storm battered the walls, rattling the rafters, but inside there was no hesitation. Elias felt strength surge through him, not just his own, but theirs combined. He had forgotten what it was to fight alongside others, to feel the power of unity. A beam above cracked, snow spilling through. Elias rushed forward, bracing it with his shoulder, the weight nearly driving him to his knees. He growled through clenched teeth, "Need support here!" In an instant, Clara and Margaret were at his side, shoving a timber into place, their strength pressing back the collapse. Together, grunting and straining, they forced it upright, securing it with rope Eliza had tied in seconds. The roof held. Minutes stretched like hours, the storm unrelenting. But slowly, piece by piece, they reinforced the barn. Ropes tightened, planks nailed, cracks sealed with snow and cloth. The cattle quieted, their panic fading as the structure steadied. Elias looked around, breath heaving, and saw the widows working with a fire in their eyes. He had never witnessed such grit, such unyielding will. At last, when the barn no longer groaned with imminent collapse, Elias called out, his voice hoarse. "That's enough." "She'll hold." They staggered back, snow clinging to hair and cloaks, faces red from wind. Their breaths came hard, visible in the cold air, but their eyes shone with triumph. Together, they had beaten back the storm. Elias pulled the doors closed, securing them with a heavy beam. He leaned against it for a moment, chest rising and falling, and when he looked up, he saw the 7 women watching him. Not as strangers, not as burdens, but as comrades who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the worst of it. He felt something stir in him, something fierce and alive. For the first time in years, he was not just surviving the winter. He was fighting it and winning, not alone, but with others at his side. They trudged back to the cabin, their bodies weary but their spirits burning. Snow plastered their cloaks, their boots soaked, but laughter bubbled from June, wild and breathless. Margaret clapped Elias on the back so hard he nearly stumbled, and Clara gave him a look, both fierce and approving. Inside, when the door shut out the storm, warmth enveloped them. The fire blazed, waiting as though it had never dimmed. They collapsed around it, peeling off wet gloves, shaking snow from their hair, their faces flushed with victory. Elias stood a moment longer, staring at them. His chest ached, not from the weight of beams or the sting of wind, but from something deeper. Pride, awe, a dawning realization that the silence he had carried for so long was not unbreakable after all. As the widows settled, murmuring softly, Elias sat down in his chair. His body was tired, but his heart beat with a strength he hadn't felt in years. He looked at them. 7 women who had walked into his life on a night when he expected nothing but cold and silence. And for the first time since Mary's death, he allowed himself to think, maybe he was not meant to live the rest of his days alone. The storm still howled outside, but inside there was only warmth and the faint sound of laughter. The storm had spent most of its fury by the time dawn came. The light that crept through the frosted windows was weak and gray, softened by the heavy blanket of snow that covered the land. The cabin was still, the air filled with the scent of wood smoke and the faint musk of damp wool drying by the fire. Elias woke in his chair, his head bent forward, the weight of exhaustion pressing on his shoulders. His body ached from the night's labor, but when he opened his eyes and saw the women scattered around the room, sleeping soundly, cloaks draped over them like quilts, he felt something stir inside him. It was not discomfort, as he might have expected from sharing his solitude. It was relief. For years he had woken to silence, the hollow kind that seemed to echo louder than sound itself. This morning, the silence was broken by soft breaths, the rustle of someone shifting beneath a blanket, a quiet murmur from a dream. The presence of life filled the empty spaces of his home in a way the fire never could. He rose carefully, his knees stiff, and stoked the embers in the hearth until flames licked the logs again. The crackle roused Margaret, who blinked awake and stretched her arms with a groan. She caught sight of Elias and smiled faintly. "Up before us all," she said, her voice husky from sleep. "Old habits, I suppose." "Cattle don't wait for a man to wake," Elias replied gruffly, though his lips twitched at the edges. One by one, the others stirred. Clara pushed herself upright with a mutter about stiff joints. June yawned wide and teased Eliza for snoring, earning a sharp retort that made them both laugh. Mary was the last to rise, moving quietly, smoothing her hair with shy hands, as though embarrassed to be seen in such disarray. Elias watched them, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar warmth. It had been so long since his cabin had seen a morning like this, full of movement, voices, and laughter. He almost didn't know what to do with it. "Let me help with breakfast," Margaret said, already moving toward the small kitchen space. Before Elias could protest, Clara chimed in. "I will not sit idle while you fuss about." Within moments, the cabin was alive with motion. Margaret stirred a pot of oats over the fire, adding what dried fruit she found in Elias's stores. June fetched water, braving the cold with a grin as she carried the bucket back in, cheeks pink from the chill. Mary sliced what bread was left, her hands delicate but sure. Elias stood awkwardly at first, unused to others tending his kitchen. He had always cooked alone, eaten alone, cleaned alone. But as the women moved with easy confidence, as though they had known the place for years, he found himself settling into it. He fetched extra bowls, set them on the table, and even caught himself humming under his breath as he cut into a slab of cheese to share. Breakfast was simple, but it tasted better than any meal Elias could remember. The table was crowded, elbows bumping, spoons clinking, laughter spilling into the air. They spoke of the night before, the storm's fury, the barn standing strong thanks to their combined effort. June declared proudly that she'd never forget the sight of Elias bracing that beam, grunting like a bull. Elias grumbled at the teasing, but the corners of his mouth betrayed him with a smile. It was Clara who steered the talk deeper. "Strange, isn't it? We all thought we were alone in our struggles, each on our own farms, each carrying our own loss. Then a storm brings us together, and suddenly we're stronger than we've been in years." Her words settled heavy over the table. Elias looked at her, then at each of the widows. Their faces bore the marks of hardship, lines etched by wind and sun, eyes shadowed by grief. But there was light in them too, a stubborn, unyielding spark. "I thought I was done," Elias admitted quietly, surprising even himself. "Done with sharing a roof, done with laughter, done with belonging. This ranch was just a place to wait out the years." He paused, staring into his bowl. "Last night, I remembered what it felt like to fight for something, not just survive." The words hung in the air. No one mocked him. No one looked away. Margaret reached across the table, her hand steady on his wrist for a moment before she drew it back. "We've all felt that," she said softly. "Losing someone you love makes the world small. But it doesn't have to stay that way." The conversation drifted after that, lighter again, but Elias carried their words with him. All morning, as the women cleaned and laughed as they told small stories of their farms and the mishaps of daily life, he listened with a hunger he hadn't known he still possessed. He watched Clara's fierce gestures as she spoke, June's bright eyes as she teased, Ruth's thoughtful silence, Eliza's quick wit, Hannah's quiet diligence, Mary's gentle humming. Each of them stirred something different in him: admiration, respect, a longing that frightened him, though he could not name it. By midday, the storm had calmed enough that the widows prepared their horses. The snow outside was deep, but the sky had cleared, sunlight glinting off the drifts like shards of glass. Elias stood on the porch as they saddled their mounts, his heart heavy in a way he hadn't expected. Clara tightened her reins and looked up at him. "You've been a good host, Elias McGraw. Better than you know." "You've been more than guests," he said, his voice low. "You've given this place back its heartbeat." Mary lingered near the steps, her eyes soft as she spoke. "We'll come again, if you'd have us." Elias swallowed hard, then nodded. "Doors always open." They mounted their horses, 7 figures against the glittering snow, their cloaks billowing in the cold wind. Elias watched them ride away, their laughter carrying faintly back to him. He stood there long after they vanished over the rise, the silence of the ranch settling in again. But it was not the same silence. This time it was filled with memory, of voices and warmth, of strength shared, of something within him stirring back to life. For the first time in years, Elias believed spring might come again. The sun had risen higher in the pale winter sky, though its light gave little warmth. The storm had passed, leaving the land transformed into a white sea that stretched to the horizon. Drifts climbed up fences, buried the wagon ruts, and softened every harsh edge of the world. The air was still, sharp in the lungs, but quiet in a way that almost felt sacred. Elias stood by the barn, checking the ropes and beams they had worked through the night to secure. The cattle moved inside, calmer now, their warm breath fogging the air. He laid a hand against the timber, the rough grain pressing into his palm, and felt a surge of gratitude. Not just for the barn still standing, but for the 7 pairs of hands that had helped hold it upright. He knew he couldn't have done it alone. Behind him, the widows readied their horses. Cloaks flapped in the crisp air, saddles creaked, and hooves shifted restlessly in the snow. The animals, strong though they were, seemed weary from the night's ordeal, their coats damp, their eyes rolling white at every gust of wind. The women moved among them with practiced ease, checking straps, adjusting loads, murmuring softly to calm their mounts. Elias turned and watched them, a heaviness settling over his chest. He had known they would leave when the weather cleared, but knowing did little to soften the sting. His cabin, warm and alive through the night, would soon fall back into its old silence. The laughter that had filled it, the voices that had wrapped around him like a quilt against the cold, would be gone. He told himself he had survived years without them, that he would survive again. But the thought of it now seemed unbearable. Clara caught his gaze as she tightened her reins. She stepped closer, her boots crunching in the snow. "We'll ride home before the next storm decides to trap us here for good," she said with her wry smile. "But don't think this is goodbye." Elias gave a small grunt, his throat tight. "Storm's still deep out there. Roads'll be rough." "We've ridden worse," Clara said. Her eyes softened. "You worry too much, old man." Margaret approached, her gloved hand briefly resting on Elias's arm. "You've been kind, Elias. Kinder than you think. You opened your door when you could have turned us away, and you shared more than your fire. That means something." Elias shifted, uncomfortable with the praise, though his heart warmed at her words. "Any man would have done the same." "No," Margaret said simply. "Not every man." June bounded up then, her cheeks red, her grin wide. "You should have seen yourself last night, Elias, bracing that beam like some hero out of a story. I swear I half expected you to sprout wings." He shook his head, embarrassed, but June's laughter rang bright against the snow. Liza rolled her eyes at the younger woman's teasing, muttering something about exaggeration, but even she wore the faintest smile. Mary was the last to approach. She stood a little apart, her small frame nearly swallowed by her cloak, her eyes downcast at first. Then she lifted them, and Elias was caught by the gentleness there. "Thank you," she said softly, almost a whisper, "for the warmth, for the safety, for letting us belong here, even just one night." Elias swallowed, words hard to find. "Doors open," he managed. "Always." Mary's lips curved in the faintest smile before she turned back to her horse. The women mounted, one by one, their figures rising above him as they gathered the reins. Elias stood in the snow, watching as they lined up at the edge of the yard. 7 riders, their silhouettes striking against the glittering white world, like something out of a dream he feared might fade when he blinked. Clara raised a hand. "We'll come back, Elias McGraw. Don't you forget it." He nodded, his chest aching. "I'll hold you to it." With that, they spurred their horses gently forward. Snow flew beneath hooves, cloaks streamed behind them, and their laughter carried faintly on the air as they rode toward the horizon. Elias stood rooted, watching until they were only specks against the endless white, until even those specks disappeared beyond the ridge. The silence returned then, settling heavy over the ranch. Elias turned slowly back toward the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow. The house stood quiet, smoke curling from its chimney, but it no longer felt empty. Inside, the air still held the faint scent of their presence, the bread Mary had cut, the wool cloaks drying by the fire, the sound of laughter echoing faint in his memory. He stepped into the cabin and closed the door behind him. The fire crackled, the same as it had the night before, but he no longer felt it was the only warmth here. He moved to his chair, sat slowly, and let his eyes wander the room. For the first time in years, it did not feel like a tomb of memories. It felt alive, waiting. Elias leaned back, his hands clasped in his lap, and allowed himself something he had not dared in a long time. He allowed himself to hope. They would return. He believed it now, not because they had promised, but because he had seen it in their eyes. And when they did, this house would no longer be a place of silence. It would be a place of gathering, of voices, of hearts beating together against the cold world outside. The storm had come and gone, but it had left behind more than snow. It had left behind the beginning of something new. Elias McGraw, the old rancher who had lived alone for years, no longer believed he was meant to die in solitude. The winter of his life still held room for spring. And so, Elias McGraw, once a man resigned to a life of silence, found his world stirred back to life on a winter's night. 7 widows had come seeking shelter, but what they truly brought was laughter, courage, and the promise that even in the coldest season, the heart can still be warmed by hope. The ranch no longer stood as a monument to loss. It had become a place where new beginnings could take root. If you were touched by this story and want to hear more heartwarming tales of love, courage, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles. That way, you'll never miss another story where the frontier meets romance in unforgettable ways.